In the C group, we had a match between Daniil Dubov and Vidit Gujrathi. They played the Queen's Gambit. After this, Knight f6, Knight f3, and now c5. Vidit plays the same opening he played against Kamer. He tries to go for some Tarash or semi-Tarash. Dubov plays the same as Rapport against Oparin. He plays e3. After Knight c6, he goes for a3. Now maybe the idea is to take on c5 and push b4. That kind of forces black to capture on c4. After bishop c4, he goes for a6. And now white castles, b5, bishop a2. White is hoping that black would capture at some point on d4 and at some point to blast the center open with d5 and have a good advantage in the end. But Vidit doesn't break the tension, he plays bishop b7 here. After queen e2, now he wants to put his rook on d1 and push d5 at some point. Now cd4 by black and rook d1, like I said. He wants to capture back with the pawn and then to prepare d5. And now Vidit plays b4. A very interesting move. Tries to liquidate as many pawns as possible on the queen side. And now Dubov takes on d4. He ignores this knight on c3. He just takes on d4 with the pawn. For example, if you take on b4 like this, there's knight b4 and we have a very interesting position after queen a5. Black goes bishop c5 next and castles, and I think it's also quite interesting to see what would happen in this position. Dubov sacrifices a piece. After e4, he temporarily sacrifices a piece. After bc, now he pushes d5. Now the queen is also under some pressure. If you go knight e7 here, it's not good for black because he can just capture on e6 and ef7 comes next. So bishop d5 leads to this, and after king f7, bishop d5, this is looking really awful because after this, king e8, there's queen e6 and black's king is just horrific. White can also afford to play slowly here because after, let's say, this, queen f7 here, you can just take on c3 first. The threat is c4 and just to get back the material. You don't have to checkmate the guy, but you can just play slowly. Or also just play knight e6 and knight f8 and claim that you're good. That's it. So d5, Vidit doesn't have plenty of good choices to play. He has to give up the piece back, but how? Vidit chose to play knight d5 and after rook d5, queen c7, now we have material balance. Rook d3, we barely have a material balance. Now capturing on b2 would be too risky because after bishop b2, the bishop comes to life and the g7 pawn becomes a target. And the bishop on f8 becomes very passive. Vidit just chose to develop by bishop e7. Now Dubov gets back the pawn. Castles and now bishop e3. White is slightly better due to his queenside pawn majority. Also, you might have some attack on the king side. Rook ac1, queen b8, and now bishop b1. He's hinting that he wants to get some knight g5 next, or queen d3. Now bishop f6. Vidit wants to be quite solid with g6 and bishop g7. Now Dubov plays rook c5. A very interesting option here was knight g5. Disregarding this bishop c3 threat. Because if you take on c3, there's bishop h7 and you can cry as black. Capturing on g5 is quite risky as well, because you need this bishop to defend your king side. If you go g6, there's maybe queen f3 and after this rook c5, but I think white doesn't have much more than repetition of moves. After this, you can just repeat moves after this. I think that's the only way to do it. I mean, you can go here, but after bishop a2, I think you still have to go back and forth. I think both sides don't have anything better than this. So this was at least an interesting try to go for knight g5 and maybe even this one. King h7, queen h5, go back, take on g6, fg, queen g6. I don't know what is this, maybe bishop h6 next. If rook f7, there is capturing, and if you take, then queen e6, and the king is in a quite poor shape. So after this you need to go to e7, but after capturing, Bishop c8, bishop e5. This is 3 pawns for a piece, so I don't know, this seems quite interesting. But let's go back to the game, let's not get too far. Bishop f6, rook c5 was played. Knight e7, now Vidit, being a very solid player, he plays for the trades. And now Dubov plays b4, tries to involve his queenside pawns as soon as possible, and now g6. Now bishop d3, attacking the a6 pawn, now queen a8 by black. h3, and now knight d5, trying to take the bishop pair from white. That's why Dubov plays bishop h6. And now I'm not sure if bishop g7 is good or not. I would say it's good, because you're just harassing this bishop, and I don't believe that white wants to exchange it. But he took on c5, takes, and rook c8. Now knight e5 by Dubov. Now you cannot capture on e5, because that would be just a disaster on the dark squares, forcing black to play f6 and losing the e6 pawn. So here Vidit just took on c5 and created a passed pawn on the c file for white. But that's short-lived, because after queen c8 the c pawn is a big target. So now he played c6 because the queen is stuck defending the knight on e5, so you cannot do much about it to defend this pawn on c5. And now c6 by Dubov, bishop c6, and knight c6. Here maybe it's better to include a move like bishop a6 to take with the tempo on a6, and if bishop b7 to just capture, and this is still better for white since he got a passed pawn on the a file on the queen side. And also the bishop on h6 is quite an annoying piece, always hindering this king. With bishop on h6, black's issue with the back rank maintains. It's not easy to solve it without exchanging the bishop, which is quite questionable, because with exchanging bishops you lack some defensive pieces. Okay, so Dubov took on c6 first after this, and he took on a6. Still, white is better because of this a passed pawn. And now Vidit plays a very smart move, g5, trying to isolate this bishop on h6. Now bishop d3. Now queen e4 is a big threat, so knight f4 by Vidit, queen e4. Now it's basically forced to exchange queens, because if you go queen c1 here, there's king h2. And now the issue is that knight cannot capture on d3 because of queen a8 and the checkmate in few moves. Vidit had to capture. Bishop e4. Still, this is a slightly better endgame for white, since he has two bishops and the passed pawn. But it's not so easy to do it, because the bishop is stuck on h6. That's the bad thing about this position for white. Bishop goes to d8, and now king f1. The king has to be more active, but now f5 by Vidit. And where to go? Where to go? Dubov went for bishop c2, which is an okay move, but there was a much nicer move to play for a win here, and it was bishop c6. What's the point of bishop c6? Well, if, for example, he goes for something like knight d3, some random move, there's bishop e8, completely making this king passive. And let's say after knight e5 there's f4, takes, and the bishop comes out, after which a4, it becomes really unpleasant for black to hold this position, because now when the king gets closer to the queen side, in combination with those two bishops, I think white has good chances for a win. If king f7 here to logically go to g6 and kick this bishop away and not to get trapped by bishop e8, now there's h4. And it's a really tough spot for black. If you go king g6, now I think you can just exchange bishop for bishop and have this a pawn very unpleasant. So I think this was the best chance for Dubov to play for a win, to get bishop c6 and bishop e8, completely shutting down the king. But he went for bishop c2, and after knight g6 he pushed the pawn, but this bishop on h6 stayed buried. And after king f7, g3 was played, king f6. It wasn't so easy to get this bishop out. Bishop cannot even go to f8, so king e2 was played, e5, f3, bishop a5, and now after g4, knight f4 was played, king f1, and after this, I don't know if this is some transmission error, but it's shown that h4 was played. In this position, they agreed to a draw, but I think that he just captured on g4. I don't believe that he would play h4 here. I guess that after bishop f8, you can just go h5. You can also go knight e6, but I feel like you can do anything you want here. Knight g6 back. Yeah, I think this is a draw because even after capturing, you can take like this and go h5. Too many pawns are getting exchanged, and there's no value in this a pawn because there's no pawns on the other side, and the bishop can just sacrifice itself for the a pawn.